You were doing so well. You know you were. The work was moving. The numbers were improving. The habit was holding. And then something happened. Not a catastrophe. Not a crisis. Not some external force that blew the whole thing apart. Something smaller, quieter, internal. And now you're sitting with the wreckage of a streak you broke, a plan you abandoned, a version of yourself you are almost becoming. And you're trying to figure out how you keep ending up here. That's the part that makes it sting so much. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't the market, or the situation, or the other person. It was you. You saw it coming and didn't stop it. Or you didn't see it coming at all, which is somehow worse. And now you're doing the thing where you replay the sequence, trying to locate the exact moment you turned on yourself, trying to understand what you are that makes you do this. That question, what am I that makes me do this, is the one we need to talk about honestly, not softly, not with a lot of cushioning, because you've had enough cushioning. You've read the gentle articles and listened to the encouraging podcasts and told yourself that you just need to be kinder to yourself, and maybe that's true, but it hasn't stopped the pattern. The pattern keeps going, and something different is needed. So let's start here with the thing most people don't say plainly enough. You are not ruining your progress because you're lazy. You are not ruining your progress because you don't care. You are not ruining your progress because you lack discipline or willpower or some essential quality that other people have, and you were simply not given. Those are the explanations that feel true from the inside, but almost never are. They're the stories the self-critical mind reaches for because they're simple, and simple feels like clarity, even when it isn't. The real reason is more interesting and more fixable, but it requires you to look at something you've probably been looking away from for a while. You keep ruining your own progress because some part of you doesn't fully believe you're allowed to have it. That sounds abstract. It isn't. Let me show you what it actually looks like. You start something new, a business, a fitness routine, a savings plan, a creative project, a different way of showing up in a relationship. Whatever it is, you started with real intention, real energy. You put in the work. It begins to move. You can feel the traction. That specific feeling when effort starts turning into result, when the gap between where you are and where you want to be is actually closing. And then, right around that moment of genuine progress, something shifts. You miss a day. You make an impulsive decision that undoes something you built carefully. You pick a fight that didn't need to happen. You spend money you were saving. You stop doing the thing that was working. The timing is almost too consistent to be coincidence, because it isn't coincidence. What's happening in that moment is not failure of effort. It's activation of something much older than the current goal. It's a belief, deeply embedded, often invisible, that this level of success, this version of yourself, this kind of outcome, is not quite for you, that it belongs to a different category of person, that you approaching it is somehow a mistake that will be corrected. This is called an upper limit, and it operates beneath the level of conscious decision. You don't think it, you just act it out. You sabotage the thing before the thing can be taken from you, or before the world can confirm what you secretly fear, that you don't deserve it, that you can't sustain it, that the version of you who has it is fraudulent in some way that will eventually be exposed. That's a heavy thing to carry, and most people carry it silently, interpreting each self-sabotage as further evidence of the flaw they believe themselves to have. The loop becomes self-confirming. You sabotage. You interpret the sabotage as proof of inadequacy. The proof of inadequacy makes you feel undeserving. The undeserving feeling fuels the next sabotage, round and round, for years, sometimes, for a whole life in the worst cases. So the question isn't how to be more disciplined. The question is how to interrupt that loop at the root. And the first interruption is this: seeing it clearly, not judging it, not being ashamed of it, seeing it, because you cannot change a pattern you haven't fully acknowledged. Most people acknowledge their self-sabotage on the surface. They say things like, "I keep getting in my own way," or "I don't know why I do this to myself." That language sounds like awareness, but it's actually still one layer up from the real thing. It's describing the behavior without looking at what's underneath it, without asking the harder question, what am I afraid would happen if I actually succeeded? That question is the door. And most people don't walk through it because what's on the other side is uncomfortable. The answers tend to be things like, if I succeed, people will expect more from me, and I'll have to sustain something I don't know if I can. Or, if I succeed, the people around me will feel threatened or left behind, and I'll have to choose between my progress and my belonging. Or, if I succeed, it will finally be visible whether or not I'm actually capable, and I'd rather stay uncertain than find out the answer is no. These aren't irrational fears. They're real concerns dressed up as self-protection, and self-protection is a deeply intelligent instinct. Your brain is not malfunctioning when it pulls you back from progress. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do: keep you within what it has assessed as the safe zone. The problem is that its assessment of the safe zone was set a long time ago, based on information and experiences that no longer apply in an environment that no longer exists. The brain's risk assessment isn't updating in real time. It's working from an old map. And here's what makes this so tricky. The old map feels like reality. The fear feels like useful caution. The pullback feels like wisdom. You can rationalize every single act of self-sabotage in real time while it's happening with reasons that sound completely reasonable. The timing wasn't right. You needed a break. You were being realistic. You were just being honest about your limitations. The story the sabotaging mind tells is convincing. It has to be, or you wouldn't follow it. This is why willpower alone never solves the problem. Willpower is fighting the behavior. But the behavior is just the surface. The belief driving the behavior is what needs to change. And beliefs don't change through force. They change through repeated, embodied experience that contradicts them. Which means the work isn't just trying harder. The work is staying in it long enough for the old belief to lose its grip. That requires something more specific and more sustainable than willpower. It requires a different relationship with discomfort, a different understanding of what discomfort in the context of progress actually means. Let's talk about that. When you're moving towards something that genuinely matters to you, building real financial stability, building work that's actually yours, building a life that's aligned with who you want to be, discomfort is not a warning sign. It's a signal that you're in new territory. And new territory always feels unstable before it feels like home. The brain registers new territory as threat, not because it is a threat, but because it is a threat, but because it's unfamiliar. And unfamiliar has historically been correlated with danger. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between the discomfort of stretching into growth and the discomfort of genuine risk. They feel similar from the inside. So when you're doing something that's actually good for you, raising your rates, putting your work in front of people, having the honest conversation, committing to the savings plan, and it feels uncomfortable, your system fires off signals that read like stop. Most people stop, and then they call it intuition, or realism, or knowing their limits. But it wasn't any of those things. It was the threat detection system responding to novelty the way it was built to respond to novelty, which is to say, with caution. The people who move through self-sabotage aren't the people who don't feel that caution. They're the people who've learned to recognize it for what it is. who've developed enough body literacy to say this is the feeling of moving into new territory, not the feeling of actual danger. These are different things, and they've practiced staying in it long enough to find out that the new territory isn't actually dangerous, that the discomfort was a reaction to unfamiliarity, not a warning about harm. That practice is what builds real tolerance for growth, not the motivational kind of tolerance, where you pump yourself up with enthusiasm until the enthusiasm runs out. The real kind, where you're not particularly excited, you're not running on adrenaline, you're just quietly continuing, one day at a time, even when it's boring, even when it's uncomfortable, even when part of you is actively looking for reasons to stop, because that part will always be there. It doesn't disappear. You don't outgrow the self-sabotaging impulse by achieving enough. You outgrow it by noticing it without following it, by letting it speak without letting it decide. The noticing is the skill, and it's more specific than people think. Most people wait until the sabotage has already happened before they notice it. They're already 3 steps in. They've already made the decision, spent the money, skipped the work, had the fight, and then they look back and see it. That's still useful. Better late than never. But the real shift comes when you can catch it earlier. When you can feel the impulse to self-sabotage while it's still just an impulse, before it becomes an action. What does that feel like? For most people, it feels like restlessness, a specific kind of itch right in the middle of something that's working, a sudden need to do something else, check something, shift gears, or it feels like a story, a narrative that arises about why this actually isn't working, why you should reconsider, why you were being naive to think this would be different this time. Or it feels like self-pity, a surge of feeling sorry for yourself that arrives out of nowhere, right when things are going well. All of these are flavors of the same thing. They're the upper limit mechanism trying to pull you back to familiar ground. When you can feel them while they're happening, when you can say to yourself, this is the thing, this is exactly the pattern, this is what it feels like right before I stop, you have a choice that you didn't have before. Not an easy choice, but a real one. That choice is to continue anyway, not with enthusiasm, not with certainty, just to keep going through the restlessness, past the story, despite the pity, and see what's on the other side. What's on the other side is always the same thing. The discomfort passes. The impulse loses its urgency. The story that felt so compelling starts to look like what it was, a construction, not a truth. And you find yourself still standing, still in it, still moving. And the progress that almost got sabotaged is still there, intact, waiting for you to keep showing up. Every single time you do that, every time you feel the impulse and don't follow it, you are directly rewriting the old map. You are giving your brain new information. You are making new territory a little more familiar. And over time, the zone that feels safe expands to include things that used to feel dangerous. Things like success, like visibility, like the version of yourself that has what you've been working toward. Let's talk now about something that operates alongside the upper limit problem, and that makes self-sabotage more complicated than it might otherwise be. It's the identity issue, and it's everywhere. Here's the mechanics of it. Every person has an identity, a sense of who they are, a story about what kind of person they are, what they're capable of, what they deserve, how they operate. Most of this story was written in the first couple of decades of life, largely by circumstance and other people, and it's been running as background software ever since. And here's the thing about identity. The brain is extraordinarily committed to maintaining it. Consistency is one of the deepest drives in human psychology. We want to be who we've always been. We want our actions to confirm our self-concept. When they don't, when we do something that contradicts our sense of who we are, The brain experiences it as a kind of threat, and it works to restore the previous state. This is why people who grew up in financially insecure households often find it hard to keep money even when they earn it. Not because they're irresponsible, because wealth feels like identity violation. It doesn't match the script, and the script, at a very deep level, feels safer than the update. This is why people who have always thought of themselves as someone who struggles find it hard to move into ease, not because ease isn't genuinely available to them, because ease contradicts the story, and the story, however painful, is familiar, it's known, and known to the brain is safe. This is why people who have defined themselves by their hustle, their difficulty, their grind, their underdog status, find it destabilizing when the grind starts to pay off. The success doesn't fit the narrative, and so they find ways, often subtle and unconscious, to bring themselves back down to the story's level. Identity is arguably the most powerful driver of behavior there is, more powerful than intention, more powerful than goal setting, certainly more powerful than motivation, which is notoriously unreliable. And the reason so many self-improvement strategies fail is that they address behavior without addressing identity. They give you tactics while leaving the underlying story in place. So you change what you do for a while, but eventually the old identity reasserts itself and pulls your behavior back in line with who you've always been. The actual shift, the lasting one, comes when the identity changes. When you stop thinking of yourself as someone who struggles with money and start thinking of yourself as someone who's building financial intelligence. When you stop thinking of yourself as someone who can't finish things and start thinking of yourself as someone who is learning to finish things. Not as a lie you tell yourself, as a genuine update to the story. That update doesn't happen through affirmations. It doesn't happen through wishful thinking. It happens through action, through doing the thing that the new identity would do, consistently enough that the new story starts to become the real story. Every action that aligns with the updated identity is evidence, and evidence accumulated over time is what changes the story for real. This is also why the early period of any significant change is so fragile. In the beginning, you don't yet have much evidence for the new story. The old story has decades of evidence behind it. One good week, one good month does not counterbalance the weight of years of confirming the old narrative. So when a setback arrives, and setbacks always arrive, the old story rushes back in to fill the space. It says, "See, you knew this wouldn't work. You knew you weren't really this kind of person. You were pretending." The response to that isn't to fight the old story. It isn't to argue with it or shame it or try to overpower it. The response is to be very deliberate, very intentional about continuing to generate evidence for the new one. Small evidence counts. A decision that aligns with who you're becoming. A moment where you chose differently than you used to. A day where you stayed in something that you would previously have abandoned. These are evidence, and they compound. This is the part of change that nobody talks about enough. The compounding of small evidence. The way a series of ordinary, unremarkable actions in alignment with a new identity gradually shifts what feels natural, gradually shifts what feels like you, until one day, the old story starts to feel less true, less immediate, less like the core truth of who you are, and more like an old chapter in the longer story. You're not erasing the old chapter, you're adding new ones, and eventually, the weight of the new chapters becomes greater than the weight of the old one. And that's when something genuinely changes. Now let's talk about money directly. Because money is one of the primary arenas where self-sabotage shows up with the most consequence, and it's worth being specific. The relationship most people have with money is far more psychological than financial. The numbers are almost secondary. The feelings are primary. And the feelings almost always trace back to the stories about scarcity, about deserving, about what money means about you as a person. Some people grew up in homes where money was perpetually tight, and the lesson they absorbed, not taught explicitly but absorbed through the texture of daily life, was that there's never enough. That money runs out. That financial security is not something people like us get to have. That lesson doesn't disappear when the income increases. It sits inside the relationship with money and shapes every financial decision in ways that are hard to see from the inside. When someone with a deep scarcity story starts earning more, they often don't accumulate the additional income. They spend it up to the edge of the new number. Not because they're extravagant, because the feeling of having more than enough triggers something. It triggers the old story's warning system. This can't last. Spend it while it's here. Don't count on it. Don't get comfortable. And so they spend. And they stay exactly where they were, emotionally, regardless of what the number says. Other people have a different story. They have money, but feel guilty about it. They came from communities where having more than the people around them felt like betrayal, where visibly succeeding felt like putting distance between themselves and their roots. And so they find ways to give it away, to under-earn, to make decisions that keep them financially aligned with the people they came from. Not because they don't want success, but because at a deep level, success feels like abandonment, and others still have absorbed a story that money is dangerous, that it changes people, that it corrupts, that wanting it is shallow, that caring about it is somehow beneath them. And so they keep themselves financially modest, not through poverty, but through choice, through a repeated unwillingness to fully commit to building financial stability, because committing to it would mean becoming the kind of person they've been taught to distrust. These are patterns, not personal failings, not evidence of inadequacy. Patterns, and patterns can be interrupted once they're seen clearly. The first step is identifying which story you're running, not the surface story, not the one about bad luck or bad timing or the economy or the market or your particular circumstances, the deeper one, the one about what you believe at the gut level, about whether financial security is actually available to you, whether you deserve it, whether wanting it makes you something you don't want to be. Because once you can see the story, you can start to question it. You can ask, is this actually true? Or is this something I absorbed from a specific context in a specific time, from specific people who had their own limited perspectives? Is this a fact about reality, or is it a belief that's been masquerading as a fact for so long I've stopped noticing the distinction? Most of the time, the honest answer is, it's a belief, one that made sense in its original context and has long outlived its usefulness. And then the work is doing what's uncomfortable, building the new behaviors, making the aligned decisions, tolerating the discomfort that comes with acting against the old story. Putting money in savings even when it makes you anxious to do it, raising your rates even when charging more makes you feel exposed, making the investment in yourself even when the old story says you're not worth it, letting the balance grow even when some part of you is waiting to find a reason to drain it. Each one of those actions is a small rebellion against the old story, and rebellions accumulated become a new regime. There's also something worth exploring in the specific mechanics of how identity change actually gets derailed, because most people understand, at a surface level, that identity matters. They've heard some version of this idea, and they try to update their identity through telling themselves a different story, through behaving as if the new version were already true, through genuine effort to see themselves differently. And for a short window, it seems to work. The new story feels real, the energy shifts, and then the old environment reasserts itself. The old relationships reflect the old version of them back. The old pressures recreate the old responses. The old emotional triggers fire, and the old coping strategies arrive, and the new story quietly recedes behind the familiar one. And the person is left wondering why the identity shift that seemed so real didn't stick. Here's what was missing. The identity wasn't grounded in behavior. It was a story told in the mind, but not yet confirmed in the body, not yet evidenced in action. And the mind can only hold an unconfirmed story for so long before the weight of contradicting behavior pulls it back down. This is why the sequence matters so much. The identity shift has to be anchored in action, not the other way around. Not, I will believe I am a different person and then act differently, but I will act differently, even slightly, even imperfectly, and let the evidence accumulate until the belief follows. The belief follows the behavior, not the other way around. This seems backwards from how we usually think about change. We want to feel different before we act differently. We want to believe before we do. But that's not how the brain actually updates. The brain updates through experience, through the lived record of what we've actually done, so the path through is smaller than most people think. It's not about generating a new belief from thin air. It's about doing one small thing that the person you're trying to become would do, and then doing it again tomorrow, not until it feels easy, just until it feels less foreign, and eventually less foreign becomes familiar, and familiar becomes natural. And natural is when the identity has actually shifted. This is also why the early weeks of any significant behavior change are so critical and so fragile. The new behavior hasn't yet generated enough evidence to compete with the weight of the old story. You're operating in a deficit. The old evidence is vast and accumulated and feels like fact. The new evidence is thin and recent and feels like aspiration. And the moment a hard day arrives, the old evidence floods back in, and the new behavior feels like pretending. You have to be prepared for that moment. Not surprised by it, not crushed by it, prepared for it, with the specific knowledge that this is the moment that counts, not the easy days, the day when everything in you wants to revert and the old story feels like the truth and the new behavior feels like a lie. That day is where the real work happens, and how you respond to that day is what determines whether the trajectory holds. Let's go somewhere different now. Because self-sabotage doesn't only show up around money, it shows up in work, in the way you approach opportunity, visibility, and the question of whether you're allowed to be seen. And before we get into the mechanics of visibility as a trigger, it's worth pausing on something that doesn't get said plainly enough. The work you're producing, whatever form it takes, whatever field it lives in, is likely better than your current exposure suggests. Not because you're exceptional in some inflated way, because the gap between the quality of what people produce and the quality of their self-promotion is almost universally in the same direction. People underrepresent themselves. They keep their best thinking private. They send the cautious version, not the real one. They show less than they have, and the reason is almost never lack of skill. It's this same pattern, this chronic underselling that masquerades as modesty or professionalism or not wanting to seem like you're trying too hard. Trying too hard to do what? To be seen, to be compensated for what you actually offer, to take up space that your contribution has already earned. The idea that visible ambition is embarrassing, that wanting recognition is somehow tacky, is one of the more expensive cultural beliefs that people absorb and carry forward without examining. It keeps genuinely capable people invisible. It keeps the rewards flowing disproportionately to people who are comfortable being loud about what they offer, regardless of whether what they offer is actually better. And it keeps you working harder than necessary for less than you're worth, interpreting the gap as a quality problem when it's actually a visibility problem. So let's talk about visibility as a trigger, with that as context. Visibility is one of the most powerful upper limit triggers there is, and it's particularly strong for people who learned at some point that being visible was dangerous, that standing out invited criticism, envy, rejection, that making yourself known put you in a position to be evaluated and found wanting. The lesson learned from that: keep your head down, don't be too much, stay manageable, becomes a professional strategy that quietly kills every opportunity for real advancement. It shows up as finishing the work but not sending it, building the project but not launching it, having something worth saying but staying quiet, writing something good and leaving it unpublished, getting to the edge of visible success and then finding a reason to hold back. Not consistently, not every time, but just enough times, just at the right moments, to keep you exactly below the threshold of the visibility that would change things. The cost of this is enormous and almost completely invisible to anyone but you. The world doesn't see the work you didn't send, the opportunity that would have come from the conversation you almost had, the income that would have followed from the pitch you built up to and then didn't make. Nobody knows what you didn't do. You barely know. It just accumulates as a vague sense that things are moving slower than they should, that you're working harder than the results show, that something keeps not quite clicking. What keeps not clicking is this specific fear, the fear of being fully seen, and it's worth being honest about where it lives in your body, because it's not abstract, it's physical. There's a specific quality of contraction when you're about to do something that will make you visible. A pulling back, a very sudden need to reconsider, an impulse to qualify, to soften, to make yourself smaller before anyone else can make you smaller. That impulse is the fear, doing what fears do, trying to protect you from the thing it's decided is dangerous. But you already know, at least intellectually, that visibility isn't actually dangerous for you. It might have been at some point. It might have been genuinely risky in a context where you were young and powerless and dependent on the approval of specific people. But that context isn't this one, and you are not powerless now. The risk of being seen and disliked, of being visible and criticized, of putting something forward and having it not land, that risk is real but manageable. You can survive it. You've survived harder things. And on the other side of the visibility you keep avoiding is the kind of traction that changes the actual shape of your life. Here's what that traction actually looks like, practically. It looks like people knowing what you do before they need it, so they come to you when they do. It looks like a body of work in the world that speaks for you when you're not in the room. It looks like a reputation that precedes you into opportunities you didn't have to manufacture. It looks like income that reflects the quality of what you actually produce rather than what you've been willing to ask for. None of that happens in the dark. None of it happens while you're waiting until it's perfect. Waiting until you're more confident, waiting until the timing is obviously right and the conditions are clearly ready. It happens when you go anyway, before you feel ready. Because feeling ready for most things worth doing comes after the action, not before it. This is one of the most consistent truths about progress. You will almost never feel ready for the thing that would actually move you. Ready is a feeling that arrives, if it arrives at all, as a consequence of doing. Waiting for it to arrive before you do is waiting for something that has it backwards. The people who consistently move are not operating from readiness. They're operating from decision, from the clear-eyed choice to proceed, knowing they don't have all the answers, knowing it might not work, knowing they might look foolish or fall short or have to try again. The willingness to accept those possibilities is what readiness actually feels like, not confidence. willingness. And willingness is something you can generate. It doesn't require special circumstances. It doesn't require that your fear disappear first. It just requires that you decide that the cost of staying put is higher than the cost of moving imperfectly. Let's talk now about something that enables self-sabotage in ways that are often overlooked. It's the company you keep, the environment you're in, the standards that are silently normalized around you. Human beings are enormously social. We regulate each other. We calibrate to each other. What the people closest to us believe about what's normal, what's possible, what's appropriate, it seeps into us whether we're aware of it or not. And if the people you spend the most time with operate at a certain level of ambition, a certain relationship with money, a certain tolerance for mediocrity, that becomes the water you swim in. It becomes what feels natural, what feels like enough. This is not a criticism of the people in your life. It's just a true thing about how human beings work. We are calibrated by our environment, and if your environment has a low ceiling for what's considered normal success, your own aspirations will unconsciously adjust toward that ceiling, regardless of what you consciously want. You can feel this in specific ways. You reach a certain level of earning, and it becomes the ceiling, not because you can't go higher, but because nobody around you is talking about going higher. Or you carry ambition for a project and then mention it to people who treat it with polite skepticism, and something in the energy around it deflates, and you find yourself less certain than you were. Or you make a move toward a different kind of life, and the people who know you best treat it with low-grade worry, as if you might be getting above yourself, and that worry gets under your skin and starts to feel like wisdom. None of those people are necessarily wrong. They're just operating from their own maps, and their maps might have different territory than yours does. The question isn't whether to stay close to the people you love. It's whether you're getting enough exposure to a different kind of normal, to people who are doing what you want to do, or something close to it, to environments where the ceiling you've been bumping up against is barely the floor. Not to make your current relationships feel small, but to recalibrate what feels possible. To give your ambitions some oxygen. Isolation from models of what's possible is one of the most reliable engines of self-sabotage, because without evidence that the thing is actually achievable by people who are not so different from you, the aspiration starts to feel like delusion. And when aspiration feels like delusion, the self-sabotaging mind has all the justification it needs. There's a specific quality to conversations where this shows up. Someone has an idea they're excited about, a business, a creative direction, a way of reorganizing their financial life, a career move that would actually use what they're capable of, and they bring it to the people around them. And the people around them respond with a very particular kind of caution. Not cruelty, not dismissal, just caution. A series of reasonable questions about whether it's really practical. A quiet note that maybe it's more complicated than it seems. A reference to someone who tried something similar, and it didn't quite work out. All of it plausible, all of it reasonable, none of it designed to be discouraging. And yet the person walks away smaller than they were when they arrived. This happens in family systems. It happens in long-term friendships. It happens in workplaces. And it happens most in the contexts where the people doing it genuinely care about you and genuinely believe they're being helpful. They're trying to protect you from disappointment, from looking foolish, from the kind of failure they've maybe experienced themselves. The caution is real, and the love behind it is real, but the effect is to confirm the doubt that self-sabotage was already cultivating. Which is why it matters, when you're working against a deep pattern, to be intentional about where you bring certain conversations. Not every idea needs to go to the people most likely to apply the brakes. Some conversations belong in environments that are going to stretch you rather than contract you. Some ambitions need witnesses who can see the possibility in them, not just the risk. This also connects to what you consume. what you read, what you let yourself be influenced by, not in a superficial optimization way, in a fundamental evidence-building way. When everything in your information environment confirms that the range of outcomes available to people like you is narrow, your sense of what's realistic adjusts to match. You start to self-limit before anything external has even had a chance to limit you. Expanding that evidence base is not wishful thinking. It's recalibration. It's giving your ambition accurate information about what's actually possible, instead of letting it work from a distorted sample. This is also where the information you consume matters. Not in a curated media kind of way. In a deeper way, what you read, what you listen to, what you spend your attention on. It builds the model of what's possible that you're working from. And if that model is limited by a diet that keeps reinforcing the same narrow range of human experience, you're not going to find much evidence that the life you want is actually available to people who started where you did. Expanding that evidence base is practical, not inspirational. It changes your sense of what's realistic. And what you believe is realistic is what you'll actually aim for, regardless of what you tell yourself you want. Now, let's talk about something that operates alongside awareness that rarely gets enough attention. The space between recognizing a pattern and changing it is not empty. It's filled with something specific, and that something is tolerance. The capacity to sit in the discomfort of being the mid-change, where you are aware enough to see what you're doing, but not yet practiced enough to stop it consistently, where you know the old behavior is happening and part of you is watching it happen, and you can't quite get between the impulse and the action in time. That space is where most people either give up or double down on shame. And both of those responses lengthen the struggle. Giving up because the gap feels too large. Shame because it feels like the awareness should be enough. And if it isn't, something must be fundamentally wrong. But that space is actually where the real work lives. It's not a sign of failure. It's the working zone. It's where the new neural pathways are being built, slowly, through the repeated experience of noticing. Each time you notice and can't stop it, you still shorten the loop slightly. You've made the behavior a little more visible, a little less automatic. The next time, you might catch it a half second earlier, and the time after that, a full second. And eventually, that second is enough to insert a pause. And in the pause, there's a choice. Tolerance for that process. For the frustrating, ambiguous, nonlinear experience of being someone who is genuinely changing is what separates the people who eventually shift the pattern from the people who stay stuck in insight without movement. Insight alone is not the destination. Insight is the beginning of a long, often tedious, frequently discouraging process of rewiring, and the tolerance to stay in that process, without needing it to look more glamorous than it actually is the real skill. Let's talk now about time, because self-sabotage and time have a very specific relationship that's worth understanding clearly. Most self-sabotage doesn't announce itself as self-sabotage. It announces itself as the intelligent management of time, as realism about what's possible given current constraints, as legitimate prioritization, as being sensible about not overcommitting. All of those things are real. Realism matters. Prioritization matters. But there's a specific quality to the way the self-sabotaging mind handles time that's different from genuine strategic thinking. And the difference is in the direction. Genuine strategic thinking asks, what do I need to do with the time I have to move toward what matters? It's forward-facing. It's about leverage, about identifying the actions that produce the most significant movement relative to the energy invested. The self-sabotaging mind asks, why is this not a good time? It's backward-facing. It's about finding the reason, the legitimate-sounding reason, that this particular moment isn't the right one to begin or continue or commit, and there's always a legitimate sounding reason. There will always be a reason. The conditions are never optimal. The timing is never perfect. There will always be something else that needs attention first. Always a reason why right now isn't quite it. The trap is that these reasons feel responsible. They feel like maturity, like not being impulsive, like taking things seriously. And sometimes they are. But often they're just the sophisticated face of the old fear. The fear dressed up in the language of practicality. The diagnostic question is this: if you look at the last 6 months, or year, or 2 years, have the reasons kept changing while the outcome has stayed the same? Have you been meaning to start or continue or commit to the same thing for a significant stretch of time, with a shifting cast of reasons why it's not quite time yet? If yes, the problem isn't the timing. The timing is a proxy. The problem is the pattern. And the pattern doesn't get resolved by waiting for better timing. It gets resolved by starting despite the timing, by declaring that now is when this happens. Not because the conditions are right, but because you're done letting imperfect conditions be the reason you don't move. That declaration is uncomfortable. It removes the safety net of the legitimate reason. It puts the responsibilities squarely on you. No more circumstances to point at. Just you with a decision and what you do next. That's exactly where it needs to be. Now let's talk about something that often goes unexamined: the role of identity in financial life, in time freedom, in the kind of independence that most people say they want but find mysteriously elusive. The life where your income is not dependent on your presence at every hour, where you've built something that produces without consuming your entire available self, is not a fantasy. It's a structural outcome. It's built deliberately over time, through specific kinds of decisions and specific kinds of actions. And the primary obstacle to building it isn't lack of knowledge or lack of opportunity. It's the internal resistance that activates every time you get close. Because that kind of independence, income that isn't purely traded for time work that has leverage in it, a life where you're not simply converting hours into dollars with nothing left over, that requires becoming a specific kind of person. It requires thinking like someone who builds, not just someone who works. It requires tolerating the uncertainty of creating something before you know if it will pay off. It requires making decisions based on what you're building toward, not just what you need right now. And for most people, those requirements conflict with the current identity. The current identity might be, I'm someone who works hard and earns what I earn, and that's just how it is. Or, I'm not the kind of person who builds businesses. Or, people like me trade time for money. That's what we do. That's what's realistic. Those identities are not who you fundamentally are. They're stories you've inherited, but they're running your behavior whether you notice them or not. There's a specific moment where this becomes visible. It's the moment when an opportunity appears, a genuine one, something that could shift the structure of your income or your work or your life in a meaningful way, and instead of engaging with it, you feel a strange flatness, not excitement. Not fear exactly, just flatness, a sense that it's probably not for you, that other people take those opportunities and you watch from the sideline, and you don't even fully know where that feeling comes from. It feels like realism, but it isn't. It's identity doing what identity does, which is maintain itself, or it's the moment when you've been building something, really building it, genuinely investing in it, and it starts to work. The early signs of traction are there, and instead of feeling elated, you feel a strange need to slow down, to be careful, to not get ahead of yourself, to make sure you don't jinx it, all of which are culturally acceptable ways of saying, I'm not sure I'm allowed to have this, and I'm going to manage my exposure to the possibility that it's real. The management of hope is a self-protective strategy, and it has a real cost. The cost is that you engage with your own possibilities at half power. You invest, but you hold something back. You commit, but not fully. You stay in, but with one foot toward the exit. And that partial engagement produces partial results, not because the opportunity wasn't real, because you didn't fully show up for it. Changing this requires the same work we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation. Seeing the story, questioning its authority, beginning to act in small, consistent ways like the person you're actually trying to become. Building evidence. Tolerating the discomfort of the mismatch between the old identity and the new behavior, staying in it long enough for the evidence to accumulate. This is not a fast process, but it is a real one. And the alternative, continuing to act from the old identity, continuing to sabotage the new behavior every time it gets traction, is not actually safe. It just feels safe because it's familiar. Let's address something that comes up consistently when people are working with these patterns. The thing that happens when you've identified the self-sabotage, you've named the pattern, you've genuinely committed to interrupting it, and then you do it anyway. You see it happening and you can't stop it. Or you stop it once, twice, 3 times, and on the 4th time it gets through. And you feel worse than you did before you started paying attention. Because now, you did it with full awareness, which somehow makes it feel more like a choice and more like a character flaw. This is a specific kind of despair, and it's worth addressing directly. Awareness is not a cure. It's the beginning of a process that takes much longer than awareness alone. Knowing why you do something does not immediately stop you from doing it. The behavior pattern is encoded in neural pathways that were built over years or decades. Knowing about them does not instantly rewire them. What rewires them is new behavior, repeated over time, creating new pathways that gradually become the default. So when you catch yourself in the pattern, even after you've identified it, that's not evidence that you're beyond help. It's evidence that the pattern is exactly where such patterns are, deep in the wiring. And the fact that you caught it means the awareness is working. The awareness does not prevent the behavior immediately. It makes the behavior visible. And visible behavior can be addressed. Invisible behavior cannot. Every time you catch it, even when you can't stop it that time, you are shortening the delay between the impulse and the recognition. You are making the pattern less opaque. And gradually, not linearly, not perfectly, but genuinely, the gap between recognition and response gets smaller, until eventually you're catching it early enough that you have a real choice, and you start making a different one. There's also a specific trap that high awareness people fall into more than others. Because they're good at analyzing themselves, they can generate very sophisticated explanations for their own behavior. They can name every root cause. They can trace every pattern back to its origin. They can explain in impressive detail exactly why they do what they do and where it came from and what it's connected to. And none of that analysis stops the behavior. Because understanding the architecture of your house doesn't mean you can restructure it with your mind alone. The house gets restructured by physical work, by moving walls, by replacing foundations. And the psychological equivalent of that is behavioral. It's the doing, not the explaining. If you have been understanding your pattern for months or years without the behavior changing, the understanding has served its purpose, and it's time to move to the next phase. The next phase is less glamorous. It's less like an insight and more like exercise. It's repetitive and mundane and doesn't produce the same aha feeling that understanding does, but it's what actually builds the new structure. This is also why self-compassion is not just a feel-good concept in this context. It's functionally necessary. Because shame and self-punishment, when applied to a pattern, don't interrupt the pattern, they fuel it. Shame is itself a form of self-abandonment, and self-abandonment is exactly the emotional state that makes you most vulnerable to the next round of self-sabotage. The cycle is, you sabotage, you feel shame. The shame makes you feel worse about yourself. Feeling worse about yourself increases the likelihood of the next sabotage. Shame is not the corrective. It's the accelerant. What breaks the cycle is something that feels counterintuitive, which is meeting the sabotage with curiosity rather than punishment. Asking, interesting, that happened again. What was I feeling right before? What stories started running? What was the specific trigger this time? Not as a way of excusing the behavior, as a way of understanding it well enough to interrupt it earlier next time. Curiosity creates data. Data creates options. Options create change. Shame creates more of the same. This is also connected to the question of how you talk to yourself in the aftermath of a self-sabotaging episode. Most people, in that moment, deploy language that is genuinely brutal, language they would never use on someone they cared about. They call themselves stupid, weak, pathetic, hopeless. They make sweeping statements about their fundamental inability to change. They treat a setback as a verdict. But you know at this point in this conversation that a setback is not a verdict. It's a data point, an event in a longer story. And the story is not finished. It is not even close to finished. You are in the middle of something that requires patience and repetition, and the willingness to be imperfect for a sustained stretch of time before the new pattern solidifies. That's not weakness. That's what change actually looks like for real human beings, as opposed to the sanitized version of change that makes it look like a single decision followed by immediate transformation. Real change is messy. It stutters. It has setbacks. It has weeks where the old behavior wins and you feel like you've lost all the ground you built. And then it has weeks where something clicks and the new behavior holds and you feel, briefly, like maybe this is actually happening. Both of those are part of the same process. Neither one is the truth about where it's going. The trajectory is what matters, not any individual moment. And the trajectory, for someone who is doing this work, who is seeing the patterns, who is building new evidence, who is maintaining the commitment even through the setbacks, the trajectory is upward. Imperfectly, inconsistently, but upward. As we start to come toward the end of this, I want to say something about what's actually at stake here, because it's easy to talk about self-sabotage as if it's an inconvenience, a drag on your efficiency, a thing that makes the journey a little longer than it needs to be. But it's more than that. What self-sabotage costs you in the end is not just specific goals. It costs you the experience of being someone who follows through, someone who builds things that last, someone who makes commitments and keeps them to themselves. And that experience, or the lack of it, shapes everything. It shapes how you see yourself. It shapes what you believe is possible. It shapes the depth of the life you build. And most painfully, it shapes the relationship you have with your own potential, which is the most costly thing there is to damage. Let me say something about that potential directly, because it's a word that gets used in vague and unhelpful ways. Your potential is not a fixed amount. It's not a talent you were born with that gets depleted through misuse or age. It's not a ceiling determined by your background or your starting point or the mistakes you've already made. It's more like a capacity that expands in direct proportion to how consistently you engage it. Use it deliberately, and it grows. Ignore it, and it doesn't disappear. It just waits. It sits there, underneath the self-sabotage, underneath the loops and the patterns and the old stories, entirely intact. That's both hopeful and sobering. Hopeful because nothing has been permanently lost. Sobering because all of it is contingent on what you do with it. Nobody is going to come activate your potential for you. No mentor, No system, no perfect circumstance. It activates through action, through the decision to keep going, through showing up for yourself when part of you is designing reasons not to. And here's what that actually requires, practically. It requires that you start treating your commitments to yourself with at least as much seriousness as you treat your commitments to others. Because most people who self-sabotage are highly reliable in certain domains. They show up for work, they meet deadlines, they don't cancel on people they respect. The commitments that involve other people get honored. The commitments that are purely internal, the ones about who they're trying to become, the habits they're trying to build, the work they've promised themselves they'll do, those are the ones that keep getting abandoned. And there's a deep message in that pattern. It says, my commitments to myself are negotiable. My needs and my growth and my development are optional in a way that other people's needs are not. I will sacrifice myself before I sacrifice my obligations to others. That's a form of self-last that sounds like responsibility, but is actually a form of self-abandonment. And it's one of the most common and least examined roots of self-sabotage. You keep ruining your progress because you have quietly ranked your own development as less important than everything else, not consciously, but behaviorally. The behavior tells the truth even when the mind doesn't. Changing that requires a reorientation that feels almost selfish at first. It requires deciding that your commitments to yourself are as real as your commitments to anyone else. That failing yourself is as serious as failing a colleague or a partner or a client. Not because you're more important than other people, because the version of you that keeps showing up for everyone else is only sustainable if you're also showing up for yourself. You cannot pour from empty. You cannot build something lasting from a position of chronic self-abandonment. The investment in your own growth, in your own becoming, in your own capacity, that investment is not indulgent. It's structural. It's what makes everything else possible. And treating it as optional is how you stay exactly where you are, indefinitely, regardless of how much effort you're applying elsewhere, because your potential is not fixed. It's not a set amount you were born with that gets depleted over time. It's something that expands in direct proportion to how much you act on it, use it, and it grows. Let the self-sabotage keep pulling you back and it contracts. Not because you've lost it, but because you've kept it unused, hypothetical, perpetually about to be realized. You are not someone who can't change. You are someone who hasn't changed yet. The not yet is important. It means the story isn't done. It means the pattern can be interrupted. It means the evidence for the new identity can still be built. It means the life you keep almost having is still available. There's one more thing, and it's perhaps the most practically useful thing in this entire conversation. Progress doesn't require you to have resolved the pattern before you benefit from moving. You don't have to have completed the inner work before the outer work can produce results. You don't have to be free of self-sabotage before you're allowed to take the next step. Both things can be happening at the same time. The work on the pattern and the movement toward the goal can coexist. In fact, they have to, because waiting until you've fully healed the pattern before you attempt the goal is just another face of the same avoidance. It's a more sophisticated version of not being ready. It dresses itself in the language of psychological responsibility. I'm doing the inner work first, but it produces the same outcome as all the other reasons. Nothing actually moves. The movement and the healing are not sequential. They're simultaneous. You do the inner work, and you take the next step. The next step, taken despite the pull of the pattern, is itself part of the inner work. Every time you move forward through the resistance, you are doing both things at once. You are building the new identity and moving toward the new outcome in the same action. That's the efficiency you've been looking for. Not a better strategy, not a cleaner framework, just the willingness to keep going while you're still figuring it out. To be someone who is in process and in motion at the same time, not perfectly, not without stumbling, not in a straight line, but forward, consistently forward, with the knowledge that every step in that direction is building something that the step before made possible. The version of you that doesn't keep ruining the good thing, that version isn't somewhere else, inaccessible, belonging to a different kind of person. That version is built from what you do today and tomorrow and the day after. Each time you feel the familiar pull to undermine and you choose differently instead. Each time you stay in the discomfort of growth instead of retreating to the comfort of the old story. Each time you treat yourself as someone worth finishing something for. That's where it lives. Not in a dramatic decision, not in a single pivotal moment where everything changes and the pattern breaks all at once. In the accumulation of ordinary moments where you chose forward instead of back. And the accumulation matters more than any single moment. This is worth saying clearly because we live in a culture that's deeply oriented towards singular breakthrough events. The launch, the pivot, the decision that changed everything, the moment it clicked. And those moments are real. But they're built on a foundation of accumulated ordinary choices that rarely get the credit. The 10 days where you did the work when you didn't feel like it. The 3 times you didn't spend money that you were trying to save. The conversation you had honestly when you could have deflected. The thing you released before you felt ready because you decided readiness wasn't coming first. None of those feel like breakthroughs, but they're what the breakthrough is made of. So when you're in one of those ordinary, undramatic moments, when it's just another day and the pattern is pulling and nothing feels particularly significant, that's actually the most important moment. Not despite its ordinariness, because of it, because the person you're becoming is built in exactly those moments, in the quiet decision to keep the commitment, in the small choice to move rather than stop, in the unremarkable act of continuing when stopping would have been easier. That's the work, and it accumulates into something real. That accumulation is yours to make. It has always been yours to make. The work is not comfortable. It's not linear. It will not always feel like progress, even when it is. But it is real, and it produces something real. Not just better outcomes, though it does produce those, but a different experience of being yourself, a less divided one, a less exhausted one where the parts of you that are working towards something and the parts that keep dismantling it are finally moving in the same direction. That coherence, that feeling of being genuinely on your own side, is what you've been looking for underneath every goal and every plan and every fresh start. Not the result, though results matter. The feeling of being someone who doesn't abandon themselves right at the moment when it counts. You can be that person. You are already partway there. The awareness you carry, the honesty you're willing to bring to the pattern, the simple fact that you're here engaging with this rather than looking away, that's already a form of being on your own side. Keep being on your own side, even when the old pattern flares up. Even when the shame tries to move in, even when the progress is slow and the results are unclear, and the inner critic has an argument ready for every piece of evidence you've built. Keep going. That's it. That's the whole instruction. Not perfectly, not without stumbling, not in a straight line, but forward. Consistently forward, with the knowledge that every step in that direction is building something that the step before made possible. You are not ruined by the pattern. You have not missed your window. The window is right here, open, waiting for you to decide that this time you're going to walk through it and stay, go.